The forest was silent. A deep, unnatural stillness settled over the vast expanse of trees and underbrush. High on the ridge, the wind sighed through the branches, but it seemed to carry no life with it. Only an eerie coldness that bit at the skin. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. Shadows stretched long, creeping across the forest floor like dark hands reaching out. It was the kind of place where the world felt untouched, a place so far removed from civilization that it had retained a pulse of its own. Unfettered, primal, here in the heart of this untouched wilderness, wolves roamed freely. Their presence hung over the land like a myth, whispered about by the few who dared enter. But this story was not about the wolves alone. It was about one. The sun had just begun to set, casting a pale amber glow that barely filtered through the thick canopy above. From the trees, a figure emerged, moving swiftly and silently through the underbrush. It was not a man or a creature of the land, it was a wolf, a lone wolf, moving with purpose, with urgency. His fur was thick, a mix of dark grays and browns that blended seamlessly with the fading light. His eyes, intense, sharp, calculating, were focused on something ahead, something he could not yet see but instinctively knew was there. The forest was his territory, and it had always been so. He knew it like the back of his paw, every tree, every rock, every scent that drifted through the air. But today, there was something different. Something was wrong. As the wolf advanced deeper into the forest, the tension in the air thickened. The usual sounds, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, were conspicuously absent. All that remained was the slow, rhythmic beat of his paws on the soft ground. The silence was unnerving. He stopped, ears twitching, his nose lifting slightly to catch any trace of movement. Nothing. He moved again, cautiously now, every step more deliberate, more calculated. His instincts were on high alert, a primal unease gnawing at him. It was as though the very trees themselves were holding their breath. A flash of movement caught his eye. Just a flicker, a shadow between the trunks. His muscles tensed, and his body coiled like a spring, ready to pounce. But it was gone. Only the stillness remained. Thicker now. Heavier. The wolf growled low in his throat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest felt different. No longer a home, but a maze. The trees seemed to close in around him, casting shadows that stretched and curled like fingers. He was not alone, that much was certain. There were others. He could feel their presence, lurking just beyond his reach, but whenever he turned his head, there was nothing there. He pushed forward, deeper into the forest, his senses on fire. Every sound was magnified. Every rustle of the leaves seemed to carry 1,000 whispers. His reflection in a small, still stream caught his attention. For a moment, he froze, mesmerized by his own image. His eyes were different now, darker, more intense. The face staring back at him was not just the face of a wolf, but something more, something ancient, something lost. Then the reflection shifted. A shape moved just behind him, a shadow that wasn't his own, standing still as if it were watching him. He turned quickly, but once again, nothing. The forest was empty. His breath quickened, a wave of dread surging through him. He could feel it now. A presence. Something lurking just beyond the trees, waiting. He was being hunted. The wolf moved with a new urgency, his instincts screaming at him to run, to escape. But the forest felt like a labyrinth. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their trunks twisting and warping, their branches reaching out like hands trying to trap him. The more he ran, the more lost he felt. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat echoing in the silent expanse. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, a hidden trap, a pit, its walls steep and jagged. He fell, tumbling through the darkness, the air rushing past him in a blur. His body slammed against the cold earth at the bottom, wind knocked from his lungs. Groaning, the wolf struggled to his feet, his legs shaking. The fall had rattled him, but it was the silence that lingered, the complete, suffocating silence, that made him truly uneasy. He took a slow step forward, testing the ground. The pit was deep, but there was an exit, a narrow passageway at the far side. The light from the setting sun barely touched the edges of the dark tunnel ahead, but the wolf could sense something pulling him toward it. He moved forward cautiously, each step reverberating in the cold air. The walls of the tunnel were rough, covered in damp moss, the smell of earth thick and musty. As he ventured deeper, the air grew colder still. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the shadows seemed to stretch, moving in ways they should not. Something was waiting for him. The sound of breathing reached his ears, slow, deliberate, not his own. The wolf froze, every muscle tensed, ready to react. A silhouette emerged from the shadows at the far end of the tunnel. A wolf, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was not the wolf he had seen in the reflection. This one was larger, its fur matted and wild, the air between them crackled with tension. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wolf's heart raced, a flood of emotions surging through him, fear, confusion, the deep, gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. Then, the larger wolf took a step forward, its eyes locked with his. And in that moment, the wolf realized the reflection he had seen earlier wasn't just his own. It was a glimpse of what he was becoming. The wildness in the larger wolf's eyes wasn't foreign. It was his own, a darker version of himself, his primal instincts, his deepest fears, his long-buried rage. It had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The larger wolf moved closer, and the forest fell away, the tunnel opening up to a vast, empty space. It was a place where time did not exist, where the line between past and future, between self and other, blurred. The wolf's reflection was no longer just an image, it was a part of him. And as the two wolves circled one another, the truth settled in. This wasn't a battle between two animals, it was a battle within himself. The tension in the air thickened, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of the wind, as the wolf faced his reflection, no longer just a shadow, but a mirror to his very soul. And in that moment, he knew. To escape the forest, he would have to confront the darkness within. The air grew colder still as the two wolves circled each other, their movements slow, measured. The larger wolf's eyes never left the smaller one, its gaze unwavering, unblinking. It was a challenge, but it wasn't just about dominance. No, this was something deeper. This was a confrontation of the self, something primal, something ancient, that went beyond the hunger for survival. This was a test of the soul. The smaller wolf's heart pounded in his chest, each beat sending a pulse of heat through his body, but the coldness around him only seemed to tighten its grip. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to prove himself, to dominate. But there was no escape in violence, no victory in overpowering the shadow that loomed before him. Instead, he stood frozen, staring into the eyes of the other wolf. The reflection in those eyes was unmistakable. The same darkness that had flashed in his own when he had seen himself in the water. The same wildness that lived within him, waiting. It was not the reflection of a rival. It was the reflection of his own fear. The larger wolf let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated through the tunnel, rattling the walls. The sound echoed, reverberating through the space, rattling the bones of the wolf. It was not a threat, but a summons, one that pressed against the very marrow of his being. The smaller wolf stepped forward. His muscles were still tense, but there was no aggression in him now. Instead, he felt something more profound. A surrender, an acceptance. The larger wolf mirrored his movements, stepping closer as well, but still, it didn't attack. It simply waited. The tension was unbearable. The darkness of the tunnel seemed to close in, suffocating, wrapping the wolves in its embrace. It was as though the world had shrunk to this one singular point, this moment where nothing existed except the struggle between the two forces, the wildness and the peace, the shadow and the light. It wasn't a fight of claws and teeth. It was the fight of the spirit that had been lost in the forest, lost in the dark. Suddenly, the larger wolf broke the stillness. It lowered its head, eyes closing momentarily as if accepting something, as if recognizing the weight of what was unfolding. It was no longer just an image of fear. It was a truth. The darkness it represented was not a force to be defeated. It was part of the wolf, part of him. It was something he had always carried with him, something that had always been within the folds of his soul, shaping him, guiding him. The smaller wolf stood still, feeling the energy shift around him. It was like the weight of the forest had lifted, like the burden of uncertainty had vanished. He knew in that moment that the only way to find peace was not to resist the darkness, but to accept it. It was a part of him, just as the light was. The two wolves stood there, side by side, in perfect stillness. The silence was no longer oppressive, but peaceful. The oppressive weight of fear had fallen away, leaving only acceptance. There was no struggle now, no fight, only a quiet understanding. Without a sound, the larger wolf turned and began to walk toward the narrow tunnel that led back to the surface, its form fading into the shadows. The smaller wolf followed, his steps more measured, his body lighter than it had felt in ages. Together, they moved through the tunnel, past the dark places where fear had once consumed him. As they emerged into the open forest, the sunlight had long since faded, leaving the world bathed in moonlight. The moon hung low, casting a silver glow over the landscape. The wolf stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of trees ahead. The forest was no longer an unfamiliar place. It was home. He was no longer the hunted, nor the hunter. He was simply a part of it all. The darkness, the light, the silence, the sound. It was all woven together, inseparable, beautiful in its complexity. As he lifted his head to the sky, the howl that rose from his throat was not one of challenge or fear. It was a song, a deep, mournful cry that echoed through the forest, a cry of release, of understanding, a cry of acceptance. And in the stillness that followed, the forest seemed to breathe with him. The trees whispered in the wind. The earth beneath him seemed to hum with life, and for the first time, the wolf understood. The darkness he had feared had never been an enemy. It was a part of him, one he had run from, hidden from, but could never escape. Now, he knew there was no need to run anymore. There was only the journey forward. The wolves had been there all along, not just as creatures of the wild, but as reflections of something deeper. They were not the ghosts of fear, nor the guardians of the forest. They were the keepers of truth, the bearers of the soul's deepest revelations. And in that moment, as the wolf stood alone beneath the vast sky, the forest knew. The tension, the unease had lifted. The wildness, both terrifying and beautiful, had found its place in the world. And so had he. He let out one last howl, this time with a sense of peace, as the moon shone brighter and the forest seemed to breathe with him. It was no longer an ancient, oppressive maze. It was the howl that reverberated through the forest, settled into the night, and for a long time all was still. The wolf stood alone beneath the moon, breathing in the cool, crisp air, his senses fully alert, aware of every rustle in the leaves, every distant call from the creatures that roamed the forest. There was no fear anymore, only the deep, resonant connection to the land that pulsed beneath him. But something was different now. As the moonlight bathed the landscape in silvery hues, a subtle shift in the atmosphere caught his attention. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, his ears flicked toward a sound, faint at first but growing clearer. It was a sound that didn't belong. A disturbance like the snap of a branch underfoot, too heavy, too deliberate. His body tensed once more, the calm of the moment briefly forgotten. Something was moving in the woods. It wasn't the usual rustle of smaller animals scurrying through the underbrush. This was something larger, something with purpose. The wolf's muscles coiled, preparing for whatever it was, but he did not move. Instead, he stood rooted in place, eyes scanning the surrounding shadows, seeking the origin of the sound. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, and the forest felt denser now, like the trees themselves were closing in, adding weight to the air. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form tall and slim, with a long, flowing mane of fur that shimmered faintly in the moon's light. It was not a wolf, not in the sense that the wolf knew wolves. This creature was different. Taller, more regal in its posture. Its eyes glowed softly, reflecting the moon like twin orbs of liquid silver, fixated on the wolf with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The wolf's instincts screamed for him to move, to flee, but his body remained still, the lesson of surrender and acceptance echoing through his veins. This was not an enemy. No, this was something else entirely. The creature did not approach, but neither did it retreat. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the wolf, waiting. Time seemed to stretch out, each heartbeat louder than the last, as the two creatures observed one another in the moonlit silence. And then, in a movement so fluid it was as though the creature melted from the shadows, drawing closer. The wolf stiffened, prepared for the unknown, but the creature's presence wasn't one of aggression. It was one of calm power. It had no need to threaten. It simply existed, as though it were a part of the very fabric of the forest itself. As it closed the distance, the wolf took a step back, not out of fear, but out of respect. The creature stopped, just within the reach of the wolf's senses, its gaze never wavering. It exhaled a breath, and the air itself seemed to shift, heavy with unspoken understanding. The forest had grown quiet again. Even the wind had stopped. The trees were holding their breath. The wolf, heart thudding with a strange combination of wonder and unease, tilted his head slightly, the question forming in his mind but remaining unspoken. Who? What? Was this? And then, as if the answer was already known, the creature blinked. Slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, the wolf felt something deep within him shift. His body seemed to hum with energy, his senses sharpening, as though the creature had unlocked something within him, something ancient, something forgotten. The larger figure stepped back, its presence suddenly less imposing. It turned, walking slowly away from the wolf, fading into the dark forest. Its silhouette, almost ethereal in the moonlight, seemed to melt into the shadows, leaving no trace behind except the faintest echo of a movement that hadn't fully taken shape. The wolf remained standing, his breath shallow and steady. The tension that had built in his chest began to dissipate. The forest around him felt different now, no longer suffocating but expansive, full of life and mystery. It was a place of secrets, of stories whispered on the wind. In the quiet that followed, the wolf's mind raced. He had faced something tonight, something that had challenged his understanding of himself, of his place in the wild world around him. The larger wolf had been a mirror, reflecting his own fears and doubts, but this creature, the one that had just disappeared, was something more. Something timeless. And now, in its absence, the forest felt alive with possibility. The wolf's heart slowed as he realized the truth. He had been marked, not by the larger wolf, not by the fears or shadows that had haunted him, but by something older, something far beyond him. The presence had seen him, truly seen him, not as a creature to be conquered or feared, but as a part of something greater. The wolf, for the first time, truly understood his place in the world. He was not merely a predator, nor a wandering soul. He was a thread in the fabric of the forest, an ancient, unspoken part of it, woven into its history and its future. The moon began to set, casting long shadows over the earth, and the wolf turned, his paws light on the forest floor. He moved forward, no longer unsure, no longer weighed down by the shadows that had once gripped him. He moved with purpose, with the knowledge that he was more than he had ever thought possible. The forest was vast, and so was he. And as he disappeared into the deep, dark woods, he realized that the journey ahead was not one of discovery, it was one of acceptance. The night had been long, but it had ended with the first light of dawn peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the path ahead. And the wolf walked into it, no longer afraid of the darkness, no longer running from the unknown. He had found his place in the wild, and now, for the first time, he was truly free. And somewhere, deep within the forest, the quiet hum of life continued. The wind whispered through the trees, the earth stirred beneath the surface, and the ancient dance of the wild went on, unchanged.